Hello and welcome to Buck Race History. I will be your host for this journey through the history of Buck Race rivalries. So, how this is going to work is I'm going to go through each Buck Race season and I'm going to look at the specific rivalries of that season. And you will see with my custom drawn maps that I spent a lot of time on. So, how this is going to work is I'm going to arrange everyone's names in sort of a rivals map. And how that's going to work is the solid lines are like the big rivalries of the season. And the farther to the left side that the name is, the more confrontational that player was on that season. So as you'll see here with Buck Race 1, we have myself, Noah, Amando, Cameron, and Freddie. Myself and Cameron over to the more confrontational side. Now the solid lines we have to talk about here is Josh and Cameron and Noah and Freddie. Those are the big rivalries. You had Cameron come in halfway through the season just to stir things up. Me and Cameron had the previous rivalry before the series. Noah and Freddie had a Buck Race rivalry, pretty much the first ever power struggle Buck Race rivalry. They were both going back and forth, and they were both getting points. They were both in top spots, and it ended with Freddie beating Noah. Now, these dotted lines here, these ones are the less important rivalries, but they were still there. So, like, me versus Freddie. I was definitely on the anti-Freddie train that season. Cameron versus Noah. Cameron was definitely more of a nuisance to Noah that season. And then you have Amando all by himself. This is what I'm going to do for some of these players that weren't very involved in more of the rivalry aspects of the season, which is fine. It's just they're just going to be on the sidelines. They're not going to be anything. So yeah, that's why Amando is here on that side. So we're going to move on to Buck Race 2, and whoa, there's a lot going on here, but I will explain it. Now, first thing you'll notice is that there's no line between me and Cameron. Me and Cameron didn't really have our rivalry as it usually is this season, so I decided to leave it out because there's already a lot of lines as is. First one I'm going to mention here is Noah and James. They were the pretty big rivalry of the start of the season. Like the first half of the season was more of a Noah versus James back and forth type of thing. And that's back when Noah actually did stuff on Buck Race 2. Second half of the season, Noah barely does anything. And that's why he gets a dotted line going through Cameron and on into me. The reason I put it through Cameron and into me, number one, I didn't have space. But number two, the rivalry between me and Noah was basically through Cameron because of the email spamming. And that's the next thing I'm going to talk about here, is the email spamming controversy. So the whole email spamming controversy, that's where you get the solid line between Amando and Cameron, the solid line between Connor and Cameron, the solid line between me and Amando, and the solid line between me and Connor. Amando and Connor were the more vocal ones of that controversy. Ben and Noah weren't really. James kind of was a little bit, and that's why he has some dotted lines towards me and Cameron. But, I mean, Connor got disqualified. I was a big instigator of that. Amando got really mad at Cameron. I was a big instigator of that. Now, I did consider drawing some dotted lines for Connor because there was a lot of times where he didn't get along with basically anyone. If I gave Connor a dotted line for every single little person that he might have annoyed, then he'd have dotted lines towards everyone, is what I'm saying. It wasn't really an issue of two sides because Amando didn't really like Connor, but, they agreed at the time. And so that's basically the gist of Buck Race 2. Email spam, the email spamming controversy has a lot of rivalries that were born out of it. And to that point, that's where most of the lines come from on Buck Race 2. So we're going to move on to Buck Race 3, where we see Iris all by herself over there. And then we have over on the left side, the more confrontational people, me and Cameron, obviously. It was the Josh and Cameron season. So you have that solid line between me and Cameron. This was peak Josh and Cameron rivalry right here. And then you're going to have two solid lines between me and James, and then Cameron and James. Now, James was a bit of the underdog this season. He was the only player not named Josh or Cameron that was actually competent at the Buck Race in this season. The new players didn't know how to play Buck Race at all, and to be honest, they still probably don't. Logan gets a few dotted lines with me and Cameron because, well, he wasn't really fond of us. Nobody was. I mean, Iris was just kind of doing her own thing. That's why she doesn't have any dotted lines, but she definitely would if she were a more active player. And so that's basically the gist of Buck Race 3. And now we're moving on to Buck Race 4, where we have only 4 players on this Buck Race. We have Josh, Cameron, Allison, and Logan. Me at the far side there, the far left side there, because everyone was pretty much after me this season. Now, Cameron and Logan do have a bit of a dotted line going on there because, well, Logan didn't trust Cameron all that much, and honestly, he shouldn't. But I have a solid line with Cameron, I have a solid line with Allison, I have a solid line with Logan. This is the season that Cameron decided to get everyone on me. And it didn't work. I did win. Now, that is to say, Buck Race 4 isn't the most interesting season when it comes to rivalries, when it comes to drama. So we are going to move along onto Buck Race 5. Now, again, Iris is all on her own, not because she wasn't that present, but because she kind of left right at the start of the season. So you have me again on the far side, but you have a little bit of a variation in the lines here. You have me versus Cameron and me versus Allison, but then Cameron versus Allison and Cameron versus Logan, because Cameron wasn't having everyone gang up on me this time. This was more of a anti-Cameron and Josh season. So you had Allison, who was trying to play us both, trying to lean into the chaos, trying to get me and Cameron to fight more so that she would have a better shot at winning. Same thing with Logan. Logan wasn't really doing it as well as Allison was. And honestly, if he were to take a side, he was probably on more of my side than he was Cameron's side. So that's why Logan doesn't really have a line to me, but he does have a line to Cameron. Logan was, if he had to watch one of me or Cameron win, I think he would have rather seen me win, just because I was more supportive of the new players. Cameron was pretty dismissive of the new players, and Logan did not appreciate that. So this is what that chart looks like. Notice there's no dotted lines. This season was pretty cut and dry. There weren't really any smaller rivalries. They were pretty big, all of them. And now we move on to the new era of Buck Race. We have Buck Race 6. So obviously, most of your confrontation is going to come from Maito or Kian. There's no line between Peko and Ace because they didn't get into many fights. The main fight magnet, the main rival magnet here on this season was Maito. He has a solid line to Ace and he has a solid line to Kian. Now, this solid line to Ace is not going to last for much longer after this season, but it was there. There was a rivalry there because they were the two in the top spots leading up to the finals day before Peko took the lead. Also, there was the big Maito-Kian rivalry at, I believe, the first, 2 episodes. It wasn't really that much, but it is one of the more major ones, so that's why it's a solid line. And then the dotted lines between Peko and Kian, and also Peko and Maito, because Peko didn't really openly get into many rivalries this season, but she definitely, behind the scenes confessionals, wasn't too fond of either Maito or Kian's antics, and so that's where the dotted lines come from. And now we're moving on to Buck Race 7, which is another crazy one. There's 7 people here. So there's a lot of lines going through here. And you can see Aaron is on the far side of the confrontation. Aaron had a lot of the rivalries. He has, 4 lines coming from him? I'll leave the big one for last when I'm talking about Aaron's. So let's talk about some of the small ones first. There are some dotted lines, but here you're going to see, coming out from Iris, there's a really small dotted line. This is what I'm going to call the Iris line. Because really, Iris doesn't have rivalries, but if she were to have some, they would be really small dotted lines. So that's why I put that there. And in this case, Iris's only rival was Ace, because Ace was the reason Iris got voted out. So that's why that's there. Some other dotted lines we gotta take a look at here is Ren and Paze and Ahmed. Really Paze, yeah, she was kind of a nuisance to most of the players, but I mean, it's in the same way that Housefly is a nuisance. They just kind of brushed her off, and that was that. She was the first person eliminated from the season, so going into that crucial back half of the season, she wasn't really that present. And then the last dotted line I want to take a look at here is Ren and Aaron. And the only reason that that's a dotted line is because they completely flipped the script in the last 2 episodes and became ride or dies. Yeah, they had a bit of a friendly rivalry going back and forth between the top spots, but by the end of the season, they were working together. So that's why it's a dotted line, because it's really not a rivalry. And it hasn't been since. Now we're going to look at these solid lines, okay? So we're going to look at the ones that don't involve Aaron first. We're going to look at the Ahmed and Ren one and the Ahmed and Maito one. So Ahmed and Ren, really, it wasn't as bad this season as it was in Buck Race 8, but it still planted some seeds this season. We had Ren, who won the list competition, and she decided to take all of the hunter bucks for herself and give everyone else the bare minimum after promising Amma that they'd go after Aaron together, and also having made a deal with Aaron. So she was gonna have to make some people mad, so she just went ahead and made everyone mad. Ahmed was really mad about this. He was calling her a snake. In Buck Race 8, was calling her a snake because of this moment. So yeah, I think this deserves a solid line. The other solid line, Ahmed and Maito, they definitely had their fights throughout the season. Ahmed did not trust Maito. Maito was just kind of vibing. So now we're going to look at the Aaron lines. We're going to look at Aaron and Maito. Yeah, the whole Aaron and Maito thing, that was really through Ace. And this is where I can talk about that other dotted line that's going through Ace. Ren had a rivalry with Maito through Ace. Ace and Maito were pretty close this season. They were good friends. And with the whole Aaron versus Ace thing, Ren being on Aaron's side, Ren and Maito definitely didn't get along in that way. So that's why the dotted line is there. And then you have the Aaron and Ahmed rivalry. That's from the very start of the season. Ahmed did not trust Aaron, and that's why Ahmed worked with Ren to get Aaron in the bottom spot. But it didn't really work out that way, and that's where the solid line between Ahmed and Ren comes in. So lastly, the last solid line I want to talk about is the most important one, and that is Aaron and Ace, because this sets up a story. This is the beginning, the first act of the Aaron versus Ace movie. And really, it's kind of insane how many chances Aaron gave Ace, and Ace screwed him over every single one. So the first opportunity for Ace and Aaron to work together was in the Log Chop Trivia Challenge, where Aaron made a deal with Ace for him to get second and Iris to win, with the deal being that Aaron would chop himself out in third place on that challenge. So Ace got into the top two of that challenge with Iris and then did not throw it. He won it and let Iris get second. And yeah, Aaron was pretty annoyed about that, but it was whatever. It was fine. Fast forward to the Prisoner's Dilemma challenge, where Aaron and Ace were partners and they had to decide each other's fate. Aaron decides to pick the split option with Ace, extend sort of some branch of trust. Ace, rightfully so. I mean, this is probably the smart thing to do. Picks the steal option and steals a good chunk of Aaron's Hunter Bucks. Ace gets pretty high in the lead with this. And then the last thing that Ace does, pretty much the last straw in Aaron's book, was he was the reason that Iris got eliminated. So after that happened, I would feel pretty confident in putting this solid line here. But not only that, it's the fact that in the final three challenge, Aaron squashed his fake beef with Ren, did the final three challenge together with Ren, completed it at the same time for a loophole, just so that they could both be in the final buck challenge with Ace, so that they could both have a chance to take him down. And Ace ended up winning this. So I can't imagine Aaron would be in any way not Ace's rival after this, because he had been burned by Ace 3 times and then burned by Ace again when he won the whole thing. But that's not where the Aaron and Ace story ends, and we will see that a bit later. But for now, let's go over to Snowstorm. Now, Snowstorm, before I get into the fresh rivalries of this season, I do have to go into some of the pre-existing ones that we saw with the Ice Guardians twist. You had me and Ace come in as Ice Guardians to compete against Cameron and Aaron. Me against Cameron, Ace against Cameron? Well, Ace against Aaron, obviously. So you had the pre-existing rivalry of Ace versus Aaron. Ace beat Aaron again. Then you had the pre-existing rivalry of me versus Cameron. I beat Cameron. That was fun. I enjoyed doing that. That was cool. I didn't put those on the chart, but just keep in mind that those do add to the rivalries, and at the end when we talk about the individual players, those are going to be factored in. So the first thing you notice is Iris is another one of the Iris lines between her and Cameron, and I do feel like this is probably the strongest Iris line, because if Iris were to have a rivalry against anybody in Buck Race, it would probably be Cameron. Cameron was the one that sent Iris out on this Buck Race, and I do feel like if you were to ask Iris who your biggest Buck Race rival is, she would say Cameron, for sure. And that just goes to show you what an insane player Cameron is, that he can form beef with Iris. Some other dotted lines we have to mention is the Maito stuff. Peko and Aaron did form an alliance against him, but that was more so an alliance against Cameron, and Maito was on Cameron's side for whatever reason. We'll talk about that later. And so now all the other solid lines this season all come back to Cameron. So let's just talk about Cameron. Starting off with Cameron and Ren. Well, he was the reason that Ren was sent into the snowstorm in the first place to be eliminated. And then you have the line between Cameron and Aaron. Aaron was the one leading the charge against Cameron, and Aaron was the one that brought together all his what he named the Peko Alliance between him, Peko, Ren, and Iris. And ultimately, Cameron was the one that sent Aaron out of the game. And then there's Cameron and Maito. I'm gonna circle back to Cameron and Maito. And then there's Cameron and Peko, who made it to the final two together. And Cameron was the one to beat Peko in that final two challenge because of a game of Deal or No Deal, which neither one of them were very excited about. But when Cameron won, as he usually does, he says it was the greatest final buck challenge of all time. So yeah, Cameron and Peko were at odds for most of the season, but beating out Peko in that final buck challenge, I think, is what really solidifies that rivalry. Now let's talk about Cameron and Maito. Ooh, let me talk about that. So after winning the second snowstorm with Aaron, they were both given an advantage. One of them gets to pick the matchups of the next round, and one of them gets to pick the categories the next round as a trivia tournament. Aaron picks the matchups, and he splits up the Camerons. So Maito gets to pick the categories. He picks, basically, without thinking of what would be a good choice for Cameron, he picks what would be a good choice for him. Which, naturally, he should. The thing is, Maito was not thinking of Cameron at all when he made his decisions of the categories. But if you know anything about how Cameron plays this game, nobody does anything in the game that doesn't relate to Cameron. If someone makes any type of move at all, in Cameron's mind, it's about him. So, of course, Maito, not knowing how Cameron plays this game, and that much was clear, he did not know how Cameron plays this game, otherwise he wouldn't have been allies with Cameron in the first place. But Maito, not knowing how Cameron plays his game, decided to pick the categories looking out for himself by giving himself the category that he felt better with and leaving the Josh trivia for the final round because he thought that would be more fitting. Now, Cameron didn't like this, which is a sentence that can be said about many different things in Buck Race, but Cameron didn't like this. And immediately upon realizing, putting two and two together, that Maito was the one who chose the categories, and he lost his preliminary round against Peko in the reality TV trivia. I may have fanned this fire too, I don't remember. But he immediately turned on Maito. He immediately cut off that final two deal he had with Maito and said, hey, Peko, we're going to go to final two. Maito, I'm going to teach you a lesson. You're going to be gone next. And that is exactly what happened. So rivalry is still there. Rivalry is not resolved. And that is why the solid line is there. Because in any other case, like let's say he was just mad at Maito for a few minutes, then it would be a dotted line. But that's not how Cameron plays this game. And I know that's not how Cameron plays this game. So solid line it is. And now our final season we talk about before we talk about the individual players and their own rivalries is going to be Buck Race 8. Now, everyone has some type of line here. I'm going to start at the right side with the dotted lines because you have people like Allison and Reese who really weren't involved in much of the rivalries this season. You have Allison and Ace get a dotted line because Ace was the saboteur who sabotaged Allison in the first challenge. And that's really all of the rivalry content that Allison was able to get this season. And then you have Reese and Peko. Now, if you'll notice, that is an Iris line. Okay. Peko did vote Reese out, but at the end of the day, let's be real, neither one of them holds any type of animosity against each other. So that's why they get the Iris line there. And then you have some more dotted lines between Peko and Ace. The only reason that I would consider this a dotted line is because they were working together for most of the season, but at the final truth ceremony, Ace cast a vote for Peko because Ace knew that if Peko was out, he would have a guaranteed spot in the final two. But unfortunately, it didn't happen because he didn't do anything to make it happen. All he did was vote for Peko and expect for her to go. But Once Peko found this out, she was not the happiest with Ace, and Ace did not apologize. He was not apologetic for it. And so that's why they get the dotted line. Not solid because it was only in like the last 10 minutes of one episode. Do you really count that? And then Ren has a few dotted lines, one of them towards Owen and one of them towards Reese. Owen and Reese were more of the reasons for that, not Ren, because Owen came into the season just thinking that the Saboteur was going to be Ren. And if you're not sure why, then read his preseason interviews. And also, by extension, Reese and Ren had a bit of a rivalry going on. They both voted for each other in that first truth ceremony. But now we get to the solid lines. And first off, actually, the first one I want to talk about this time is the continuation of Aaron versus Ace. And I would say that this is one that just happened more naturally. I would say that this was going to happen anyways because Ace was the Saboteur. And Aaron, after he got the clue, figured out that Ace was the Saboteur. Only problem is, Aaron didn't have the best reputation. And especially with Ace. Aaron definitely has a lot of reason to be throwing Ace under the bus. Ahmed knew that, Peko knew that. So just looking at the circumstances of the buck race that was laid out to them, Ace and Aaron couldn't resolve their rivalry even if they wanted to. Some other solid lines you'll notice, Ahmed has a lot, but we'll get to those. We're going to talk about Aaron and Owen next. Yeah, they did not like each other this season. Owen was one of the most passionate votes for Aaron in that second truth ceremony. While Aaron never voted for Owen because he basically knew and everyone else knew that Owen was not the Saboteur the way he was acting. But they did get into a few scuffs, a few fights, if you may. One of the biggest ones being at the episode 3 gift challenge. Owen's story was certainly interesting, and Aaron had a lot to say about that. Ahmed had a lot to say about that, which is the solid line between Ahmed and Owen. Ahmed and Owen were not really fans of each other. Ahmed gave Owen the nickname of the Riddler, which was very fitting, also very funny. And then we have a situation here. Ahmed has a solid line with Aaron, and he also has a solid line with Ren. Now, I really don't know where to start with this, but let's see. Ahmed, Aaron, and Ren, from Ahmed's perspective, they came into this season with a 3-person alliance, the Buck Race 7 alliance. They were all rookies on Buck Race 7. So they were going to stick together, and then Peko was also in with them. That was their 4. They brought in Ace just because he was another Survivor person. So that was a 5 majority. Now, Ahmed was a bit paranoid this season, let's be real. And he noticed that Ren and Aaron were not really filling him in on stuff in the game. They weren't talking to him much, so he assumed that they were talking with each other, and he assumed that one of them must be the Saboteur, and that, in fact, no, he knew that the Saboteur was Aaron. So he goes after Ren, and he brings Ren in, and he says, hey, I know Aaron's the Saboteur. I know you guys are talking about it behind my back. And Ren is just confused, honestly. She is just so confused at this accusation that Ahmed's throwing out. So Ahmed starts going off on Ren, and he's saying how she betrayed him in Buck Race 7, and she's going to do it again. And this all culminates in Ahmed and Aaron, who were beautifully partnered up in the episode 5 challenge. Couldn't think of a better combo. They won that challenge, which conveniently enough was a clue to the Saboteur. And they really were the perfect pair to win this clue to the Saboteur. Aaron decoded it, Ahmed didn't. Ahmed was pretty set in his mind that Aaron was the Saboteur, and nothing that Aaron was going to say was going to change that. And so Ahmed and Peko led the charge to get Aaron voted out in the second truth ceremony in a 5-2 vote. It was pretty dang unanimous. The only person outside of Aaron that didn't vote for Aaron was Ren. So that's going to wrap up the rivalries for Buck Race 8, but we're not done yet, because now we're going to look at the individual players. So how these charts are going to work is the biggest rivalries that person has are going to be at the top, and the smallest rivalries are going to be at the bottom. So if you're thinking about potential Buck Race rivals pairings, then the top of the chart is people who would be pretty locked in, pretty good picks for a Buck Race rivals season. Like they would be a good representative of what a rival season is supposed to be. People at the bottom, now those are your Anisas and Ashleys. Those are your Franks and Bananas. Like, those are the people that if they were paired together in a rival season, you'd be like, what? And that's the point of this chart, basically. So starting off with Cameron, this is a lot of names. 13 names on this chart. I could put more. I just decided not to because I was running out of space. But you have, at the top of the chart, you have the Cameron and Josh rivalry, pretty strong. That is the pretty much the backbone of Buck Race rivalries right there. You also have the Cameron and James rivalry, which is also pretty strong. And I will talk about why when we get to James's slide. Then we also have the Logan Cameron rivalry, pretty strong. That's pretty high up there. The Connor Cameron rivalry, I decided to throw on there. And then right below him, you have the Maito Cameron rivalry. That's pretty fresh. That's pretty new, pretty unresolved. Then you have the Cameron and Aaron rivalry. That's also pretty fresh. It's also pretty new. And then a tier below that, you have the Pecco Cameron rivalry. Really, Pecco is not that much of a rival with Cameron, but let's be honest, who isn't a rival with Cameron? And then people who don't even have lines connecting are people that I just threw at the bottom of this chart. Cameron has a lot of rivalries, okay? And he could potentially be paired with any Buck Race player in history to be his rival. You have Allison, you have Amando, you have Ahmed, you have Noah, Ren, and Iris. I didn't mention with Ahmed. I did not mention with Ahmed in the previous ones because they never actually did a Buck Race together. They've only interacted through guest judging appearances. Cameron guest judged in Buck Race 7 on a challenge that Ahmed played in. They didn't really have any too big of a problem with each other then. But then Ahmed guest judged in a snowstorm challenge, the one that I beat Cameron in, because I beat Cameron in that Buck Race snowstorm challenge. That happened, and I'm proud of it. Ahmed was a guest judge in that, and he was part of the unanimous jury to let me win against Cameron because he decided my story was better than Cameron's story. And this is where Cameron started to push back on that a little bit. He's like, what? What do you mean? Like, your critiques don't make sense. You gave Josh more critiques, but you gave me a lower score. And Ahmed didn't really put up with that because it's Ahmed. And they just had a bit of a back and forth. And then that also culminates in Buck Race 8 when Cameron came back for the finals, not the finale, but the finals, the Final Four challenge, the roast. He helped judge that, and Ahmed definitely took some shots at Cameron in his ace roast. So they're definitely a bit back and forth rivals at this point. But Ahmed is, if they did a season together, honestly, Ahmed might be higher on this chart. But the fact of the matter is they haven't done a season together, so Ahmed is at the bottom with the rest of the scraps, basically. And now we're moving on to the next chart, Amando. A lot of these people not named Josh or Cameron in the old era are going to have fewer people on their charts. That's just the reality of it. And two of those people, you can count on basically every single one of them, are going to have me and Cameron on them. So Amando has me and Cameron up top. Connor towards the bottom, dotted line, not as important. But it was definitely there, and I definitely would have put a dotted line between Amando and Connor if that chart wasn't so cluttered as it was. All right, next up you have me. Obviously at the top, Cameron. Backbone rivalry, as I've stated. And then you're going to have James next up on the chart. He was also a pretty big rivalry, and I will get into those rivalries when I talk about James's chart. And then next up you have Noah. Me and Noah were mostly rivals within the Buck Race 1 to 2 era. There weren't too many moments of us working with each other. And then you're going to have Connor and Amando as your last two solid lines on the list. I just included those. And then the dotted line between me and Allison would be a solid line if not for Buck Race 5, and also if not for the fact that Allison's basically an executive producer on Buck Race at this point. Like, realistically, if you were to see a rivals pairing of me and Allison on a Buck Race rival season, you'd be like, what? And then the scraps at the bottom, they don't have lines connected to them. Me and Logan, which was mostly patched up on Buck Race 5, and then me and Freddie, which was mostly outside of Buck Race. We did have our rivalry in Buck Race 1, but we also had a pretty big rivalry in the lead up to Buck Race 2, when Freddie was a producer of Buck Race. And I sued him. I sued the show, basically. It was a whole thing. But that isn't within Buck Race itself. If I was to go outside of Buck Race to pick out rivalries, I'd have a lot to talk about. But we're not doing that in this video. So, now we are going to move on into the Noah chart. Noah has the Freddie rivalry, Buck Race 1. Noah has the James rivalry, Buck Race 2. And then me and Cameron, which kind of spreads between the Buck Race 1, Buck Race 2. Not too much to go over for him here. Next up, we have the Freddy chart, which is pretty barren. I mean, you have the Freddy and Noah rivalry. That one's pretty iconic within the Buck Race 1 lore. Then you have the dotted line between Freddy and Josh. It's not that important compared to the Freddy and Noah one. That's why it's a dotted line. And then now we move on to the Buck Race 2 people. We move on to Connor, who, surprise, surprise, only has 2 names. And surprise, surprise, they're me and Cameron. Ben does not get a slide because, as you'll remember, he didn't have any lines connected to him in that Buck Race 2 chart. James, on the other hand, let's talk about James. I'm going to talk about the Noah one first, actually, because James and Noah, that would still make sense as a rivals pairing. That's why Noah's not, like, super far down. But me and Cameron definitely had more of a rivalry with him. James and Noah, they were fighting towards the first half of Buck Race 2. I have the Facebook comments to prove it. And then you have the whole me and Cameron situation. This was more of a Buck Race 3 thing, honestly. I think it definitely escalated more in Buck Race 3 because James was the underdog, as I've stated before, and he definitely had to work with either me or Cameron in some sort of a way to make sure that the other person didn't win. And so he was more on my side at the time as opposed to Cameron. He was more close to me as a friend than he was to Cameron as a friend, as ashamed as I am to admit that. He definitely was more of on my side. But then Get Your Sleeve happened. Now, for those of you uninitiated, towards the middle of Buck Race 3, I think, James and myself were sitting in woodshop class. And we both sat next to this one kid. And he spilled something, I think, on James's project. And he told him to get your sleeve and wipe that up. Me, being the nuisance that I was, I ran that joke into the ground. Every time I saw James after that, it was get your sleeve. James, get your sleeve out of here. James, get your sleeve. Every single time. I ran get your sleeve into the ground, and he was not fond of me for that. He didn't like me after that for some reason. So he, at that point, moved towards Cameron's side of things to try to get me to lose. Only problem is Cameron expected James to lie over and die in challenges for him. And as we've stated before, that's how Cameron plays the game. If you're not self-sacrificing for him, are you really on his side? So at that point, if you're James, horrible thought, I know. If you're James and you have one guy over here that's expects you to roll over and die and just let him win everything, or else you're not going to work with him. And one guy over here who is absolutely running a joke into the ground about something you said and annoying you to no end, and both of them are winning, both of them are doing much better in the game than you are, what choice do you have other than to kind of roll over and give up, which is what he eventually did? Now, him and Logan were more on my side of winning. They wanted me to beat Cameron, which I didn't, but I'm not going to talk about that. So yeah, those rivalries of me and Cameron, I think, are more of a rivalry than him and Noah, because him and Noah only lasted a little bit, whereas his rivalry with me and Cameron were definitely overarching throughout Buck Race 3. Iris's chart. Now, I honestly considered giving both of these Iris lines, but Iris and Ace got the Iris line. Iris and Cameron get a dotted line because, like I said, if you were to ask Iris who your biggest rivalry in Buck Race is, she'd probably say Cameron. And then next up we have Logan. We have the solid line between him and Cameron. He's definitely more concerned with this rivalry with Cameron than he would with any rivalry he ever had with me. So that's why I get the dotted line. And then you have Allison with one solid line to Cameron, because who doesn't have a solid line with Cameron at this point? We're just handing them out. And then the dotted line between me and Allison. I am higher on the chart than Ace, who also has a dotted line with Allison, because the whole Ace thing happened in one episode. And now we move on to the new era players. We're going to start off with Kian. Dotted line with Pecco, like I already said before. And then the solid line with Maito. I kind of already went over these. Next up, we have Ace. A lot of people here. But we're going to start off at the top of the chart with Aaron and Ace, the quintessential new era Buck Race rivalry. I couldn't not have Aaron at the top of this chart. And then, by extension, that kind of puts Ren pretty high on the chart, sort of mid-level. Right in there is also Pecco. Pecco gets a solid line to Ace because that conflict that they had at the end of Buck Race 8 is still unresolved. I gave it a dotted line in the actual Buck Race 8 chart because it wasn't really there much, but within the personal chart, now it's unresolved. Now it kind of has to be a solid line. Then you have the Iris line with Iris. We've gone over that. Then you have the dotted lines with Allison and Maito. Now, the Maito one's kind of resolved. They're kind of best friends now, so I really contemplated not even putting Maito on this chart, but it was such a big thing on Buck Race 6, I kind of had to. And then the one with Allison we already talked about. Next up, we have Maito and I decided to put Ren higher on his rivalry chart than Aaron, simply because I feel like him and Ren are more evenly matched in the rivalry department. Because Aaron and Ace, that's the quintessential rivalry. Maito and Ren are their best friends, respectively. Maito is Ace's best friend, and Ren is Aaron's best friend. So naturally, they're also going to be rivals, and I could see if in a rivals pairing world, if Aaron and Ace are rivals, Maito and Ren could easily be rivals just as their friends. And then Maito has the few solid lines. There's one with Ahmed, obviously. There's one with Cameron that's still unresolved. That's a solid line. And then there's one with Kian that's a bit farther down. There's a dotted line with Peko because Peko and Maito have never really been on the same side in a buck race strategically. So that's why that's there. And then Ace is just kind of floating towards the bottom. All right, next up we have Peko with only one solid line towards Cameron. All the rest are dotted lines because Peko's not the rival type of gal, you know what I'm saying? Reese, Maito, Kian, in that order, I would say. Let's move on. Pays. Solid line with Ahmed because Ahmed seemed like he was the most annoyed with Pays. And then the dotted line with Ren. Let's move on. Ahmed. Okay, we're going to talk about Ahmed. I put Ren at the top of this because if you were to ask Ahmed who he considers to be the biggest liability to his buck race games, he would say Ren. For sure, he would say Ren. So Ren is at the top of his rivals chart. If Ren and Ahmed were a rivals pairing, I think nobody would bat an eye. I think pretty evenly, solidly defined rivals at this point in time. Aaron is below Ren because, again, Aaron is Ren's friend. Ahmed doesn't trust Aaron after Buck Race 7, and he definitely doesn't trust Ren after Buck Race 7. And the fact that they're both friends and ride or dies in this game, Ahmed is going to be wary of them. Solid line between Cameron. Count how many times I've said that in this video. Solid line between him and Owen. And then he has a few dotted lines, like I said with Pays I mentioned already. And then the dotted line with Maito is not as important as his other rivalries, particularly Ren, Aaron, Cameron, Owen. Maito and Ahmed as a rivalry really doesn't compare to that. But there's still definitely a world in which Ahmed and Maito could be rivals pairings. And I don't think that would be too far-fetched. Next up, we have Ren's chart. Okay, so as I've already mentioned with Ahmed, Ren and Ahmed, give it some more time, and I could definitely see Ren and Ahmed going up as one of the more quintessential buck race rivalries. You have Ren and Owen, obviously have a solid line. Ren and Maito, like I've said before, Maito is Ace's friend, Ren is Aaron's friend. Solid line with Ace, just because Ace has beaten Aaron a lot, and by extension, Ace has beaten Ren a lot. And then her dotted lines with Pays, with Cameron, because it's not as important, but definitely that could be solid if you wanted to. And then there's the one with Reese, where they both voted for each other in that first truth ceremony. But honestly, I don't know how much animosity either one would have towards each other in another buck race. Then you have Aaron's chart. Like I said with Aaron and Ace, quintessential buck race rivalry of the new era. That's why Ace is at the top of that chart. Then you have the Ahmed stuff we already went over, and then you have the Aaron and Maito rivalry, mainly because of Maito being Ace's friend, and then you have the solid line between Cameron, and the solid line between him and Owen. They've definitely gotten into their fair share of fights with Aaron. And yeah, Aaron doesn't have as many people as I thought he would on his rivalry chart, but if you'll notice, they're all solid lines. Like, it's all or nothing with him. And now we're going to talk about the brand new players fresh off of a Buck Race 8. Reese only has dotted lines, one with Peko and one with Ren, which we kind of already talked about. And then you have Owen. I think you could make an argument Peko should be on this chart, but they were kind of getting along towards the end in some weird type of way. So yeah, Aaron at the top, more so because their fight was probably the most vicious. Then Ahmed, Riddler. And then Ren, I think, at the bottom of it, because that's more of a one-sided thing. I don't think Ren really thinks about Owen that much in buck race history, but I think the other two, Aaron and Ahmed, were more concerned with Owen in the game. There you have it, folks. That is the complete history of buck race rivalries, complete with charts and everything. This took me a while. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but I really hope to do more of these buck race history lessons in video format.